Valued listeners, today we have an interesting break of genetics and culture. We are going to discuss some material which implies that our cultures are actually molded in part by our genes. Kind of a controversial topic, but definitely worth investigating. Please bear with us because neither of us are geneticists, so we are doing our best to explain the studies as they should be understood by laymen as ourselves. Are you looking forward to the episode, Brandon?
Yes, I very much am, Verv. Would you like me to explain what an allele is now, or are you going to go into the extract?
You know what? Let's give them a taste of the honey and we'll go right into the abstract to begin with before we talk about alleles. So the study that I am actually referencing right now was put out by the Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience Journal. It's done by Baldwin Way and Matthew Lieberman. The abstract of it says that given that there is a higher prevalence of these putative social sensitivity alleles in East Asian populations than in Caucasian populations, there may be a relationship between the relative proportion of these alleles in the predominant cultural forms in a population. In collectivistic cultures, relationships are enduring due to social ties that are reified by mutual obligations between members of the family, clan, or religion. These relationships are so salient that the self is defined by them. Thus, the implicit construction of the self in members of these cultures is inherently relational. This social construction of the self may be akin to an implicit social support network that is likely to buffer individuals with social sensitivity alleles from the adverse consequences of stress and improve life satisfaction. In contrast, in individualistic cultures, where there is a high degree of focus upon personal autonomy, individual needs often supersede the needs of the group. Thus, relationships can be more transitory, which can lead to the perception that one is not a part of a social network. This might be particularly challenging for individuals with social sensitivity alleles. Heightened concern of social rejection also appears to be related to social collectivism. Yamaguchi and Call, higher levels of collectivism were correlated with greater sensitivity to social rejection using Mehrabian's sensitivity to rejection scale, which is the same scale that was associated with the A118G polymorphism. This greater sensitivity, cues of rejection, and greater concern over the consequences of rejection could lead to the subjugation of self-interest for the interest of the in-group, a hallmark of collectivism. So now that we've gotten this abstract out of the way, and we got the basic idea that certain genes in East Asian societies correlate with social sensitivity, let's finally find out what an allele is.
Yeah, that's right, Verv. So we're going to just back up a little bit. And you heard Verv talk a lot about alleles, probably wondering what he's talking about. I know I didn't know what they were before I read the article, but now I think I have a bit of an understanding of them, and I'm going to try to explain them to you. So the shortest way to describe what an allele actually is that an allele is an alternative version of a specific gene. So new alleles come into existence through mutations, in which alleles are forced to compete with one another in any given population. So if the allele gives its host a survival advantage, it may come to dominate the population over many years. So one of the examples that I seen online was a very simple example of a frog, let's say. And frogs, of course, have a gene for eye color. Now, different frogs may have different alleles for their gene that is considered for their eye color. So for one example, a frog may have an allele for brown eyes, and another frog may have an allele for green eyes. Now, those alleles will compete with one another in that given population, and if one of the alleles proves to give that animal or that human a advantage over the other allele, it will manifest itself most likely in the population over a long period of time. Thus, alleles compete with one another, and to apply it to what Verv said with East Asian populations, this means that East Asian populations over thousands of years most likely have acquired this specific allele that we're talking about that predisposes them to collectivist behaviors. Now, which allele are we talking about here? Well, we are talking about an allele that is named 5-HTTLPR. I know that's hard to understand, but just understand that this is the location of the specific allele in your in your chromosomes that we're dealing with here. Now, I'm going to read a quote from an article in the Japan Times from a psychologist at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, by the name of Joan Chow. She explains what the HTTLPR allele is very succinctly, so I'm going to quote her. She says, "It comes down to a short chunk of DNA that we all have in varying amounts. The chunk is found in the serotonin transporter gene on chromosome 17. You'll have heard of serotonin, a chemical commonly associated with feelings of happiness. We tend to feel happier when there is more serotonin in the bloodstream, which is why stopping it from being mopped up by using drugs such as Prozac can benefit people suffering from depression. The serotonin transporter gene's job is to make a protein that carries serotonin away to be recycled. As in most genes, there is a region of the serotonin transporter that controls how much of the gene product is made. It controls the expression of the gene, which is like saying it's the tap regulating water flow into a bath. In 1994, geneticists discovered that this region, which is named 5-HTTLPR, occurs in two forms, a long and short form. People who possess the long form make more of the product than the short form, and more of the transporter product means less serotonin is left in the system compared with people with the short form. So, Verv, why don't you apply this to the East Asian populations and European populations, and how the different populations have different percentages of this short allele serotonin transporter?
Definitely. Specifically in the Joan Chow study, we found that from East Asian populations, 70 to 80% of people have the short form, which again is the allele that doesn't produce the large amount of serotonin. And in a typical European sample, only 40 to 45% had the short form. So we could say around half of Europeans compared to roughly half as many Europeans tend to have the allele as do Asian people. Now, if we go back to the other report that we were looking at earlier, that we read the abstract from, there were also two other genes that were associated with collectivist and individualist behavior. These were the G allele and the MAOA alleles. Now, the G allele, to quote from the report, was associated with greater sensitivity to rejection. Additionally, this group also assessed the relationship of the A118G polymorphism to neural response during actual episodes of rejection, in which the participant was excluded from an online ball-tossing game with two supposed others. Consistent with the findings using the trait measure of sensitivity to rejection, individuals carrying the G allele also had greater levels of neural response to this rejection episode within multiple brain areas known to be involved in the processing of physical pain. Now, let's look at MAOA. Within the gene coding for MAOA, there is a particular form of variation referred to as the MAOA UVNTR that is associated with differences in the expression of the MAOA gene. Using the previously described social exclusion task in the scanner, our group found that the MAOA UVNTR was associated with a degree of exclusion-related neural activation, such as the individuals with the low-expressing alleles had the greatest response within the portion of the anterior cingulate associated with the reported distress to exclusion. And that is what the report said. Now, those are both very long ways of saying that people with the G allele and people with the low expression allele of MAOA are far more likely to experience pain from social rejection and to want to be socially included. So now when we actually look at how these alleles and genes are spread out between populations, we see a very stark contrast. Of course, we would all agree that one of the more individualistic countries in the world would be Sweden, very famous for kind of the libertine lifestyle, the very personally empowering culture. And on the opposite end, you would find a country like Japan. So when we look at the proportion of a population with the G allele, we find that somewhere around 47% of Japanese people have it. The next highest are Thailand, Colombia, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, and all the way down to India and Pakistan at around 26-27%. These are all Asian countries with the notable exception of Colombia, and all of these are generally associated with collectivist cultures. On the opposite end, near Sweden, you have Germany, Australia, Netherlands, Finland, Norway, Denmark, England, Canada, USA, Switzerland, Russia. These countries, of course, are in the European sphere, and they are associated with more individualistic behavior. Interestingly enough, Nigeria also shows up on the poll, and they actually had less people than Sweden with the allele. The next one we'll talk about is the low expression allele variation of MAOA. In this case, the results are even more in stark contrast, because when we have the low expression rate, this is the expression for people who will be particularly sensitive to social rejection. We have at the very top of the list China, Japan, and then Taiwan. No other Asian countries were measured in the report. And in China, we're talking about, around 67% of people having low expression alleles. Japan at maybe 63. Taiwan a little bit below 60. On the opposite end of the scale, we have Sweden, where maybe only 15% of people have low expression alleles. And then it jumps up to Canada, Netherlands, Denmark, France, Poland, Brazil, USA, Germany, and Italy, which cluster anywhere from 22 to 40%. What's also interesting to point out about this is that of these countries, we would also agree that it would likely be, if you were to say who would have more of a collectivist culture among European countries, you wouldn't think of Sweden right away. But, places like Germany and Italy might stand out. So basically, to unpack that in maybe more obvious terms, let's say you have a family of 5 people, and you've got a Swedish family and you got a Chinese family. In a Swedish family, statistically, it would be likely that just 1, maybe 2 people in a family of 5 would have low expression alleles and thus would be sensitive to social rejection. But in a Chinese family, where 2/3 of people basically have these alleles, it's much more likely that 3 of 5 would have this sensitivity, maybe even 4 of 5. And if you look at the G allele, we have a situation where only around 10% of Swedes, 7% of Swedes would have this expression, whereas 45 to 70 or 45 to 50% of Thai and Japanese people would have an expression. So, and then in this case, less Swedes, significantly less Swedes, would show the gene sensitive to social exclusion, while nearly half of Japanese or Thai people would have it. So basically, in an average group of people, you're going to see, in some cases, half to 70% of an East Asian population being sensitive to social rejection, whereas you'll only see a tenth to maybe just 20% of a Scandinavian group being sensitive to social rejection. So you could see how, with these sort of number breakdowns, it would actualize it itself across the whole culture, and the cultures themselves would take radically different forms. What do you make of that, Brandon?
Yeah, it's all very interesting, and I guess I would also sum it up in sort of other words as well. I would say something like we have, right, short forms and long forms of this allele, right? So the short form, as Verv says, is more common in East Asia. It's linked to depression. It's linked to anxiety. It's linked to negative mental diseases, okay? The long form, which is more common in Europe, is associated with greater well-being and individualism, right? So what we think here and what the studies are trying to show is that collectivist societies are able to reduce the amount of the psychological pressure people feel. They do this by lowering the amount of individual stress that people feel, because the society spreads that stress out amongst more people rather than loading it up on an individual. So what we're saying here is that collectivist societies seem to have developed as a coping mechanism to help people who are more prone to mental disease by giving them more support. So the reason why this is important and big news is because nobody would think that collectivist societies like East Asian societies like Japan, South Korea, and China, nobody would think that these societies are collectivist because of their genes. Common reasons that have been given for the propensity for collectivism in these societies are things like Confucianism or religions like Buddhism, for example. Things like that have always been pointed to as to why they are more collectivist. And things like, Christianity and, the Protestant work ethic and Western philosophy have always been reasons people have given for why the West and America are more individualistic. But see, this study is showing us and telling us that perhaps this is genetically embedded within us, and the genetics came first and the cultural dispositions came afterwards. Thoughts, Verv?
That's exactly right. And this is also obviously a very sensitive thing because it challenges some of the fundamental assumptions that we tend to have in the West. We tend to really believe that our choices in life are super important and that we can kind of will ourselves to be a certain way. And while that's kind of, I'm not saying that's entirely untrue, but it's also definitely the case where if you are really not actively exercising your will, you really are going to be someone who's falling into ruts very easily. As this shows, people are going to be born where they are just going to experience more pain from social rejection. And it's something that you're going to have to actively try to control to get over that. So the blank slate ideas that we have, I think, are entirely wrong.
Yeah, this study flies in the face of, common liberal thought in that, and everyone kind of admits that culture is important, but many people would say, though, well, you can change your culture easily. That's sort of what America is sort of meant to represent. Come here, It doesn't matter what culture you're from, come to the United States and adapt and, take on the culture of this new mother country. And, hey, anybody can do it because, we're 100% adaptable when it comes to culture. But, what this study is saying is, well, maybe that's not actually true. Maybe our culture is more genetically embedded within us than we first thought, which makes it much more difficult for people to leave culture behind, leave it at the door, and take on a new culture. One of the things that we hear from Europeans is that, well, all of these new Muslim immigrants are going to become European. They're going to take on European values, and they're going to become Swedish or become German. And the anecdotal evidence, of course, has showed us that this doesn't seem to be the case. Even people who are, third-generation immigrants from third-generation immigrant families in places in Europe still seem to be stuck in the old cultural ways of North Africa and the Middle East. And there seems to be a kind of, dumbfoundedness about why this is the case. And I think studies like this can shed some light on why that might be the case, because people genetically are predisposed to the culture. It doesn't matter how much, you try, or it doesn't matter, which country you put them in and how good it seems in Germany or Sweden, they still might fall back on their genetic predispositions.
I would even put it this way, that it's potentially disastrous to really expect that entire family units begin conforming to a completely different way of life. If you have a family unit that does have genes that are quite sensitive to social rejection and anxiety, trying to shoehorn them into a very westernized culture and trying to get them to behave in a way that mimics typical Western forms, will fundamentally make them less happy. It's not really a good fit. And they would have to sacrifice much more to be comfortable than is probably actually merited. So it's almost inappropriate to expect people to necessarily conform. And with that regard, it's also inappropriate to expect a culture to change to be reflective of something that it actually is not. So when you talk about places like Sweden adopting a more sexually libertine culture, perhaps this is a very natural evolution, and you could even argue that for significant members of that community, it's something of a good fit, even if we do think of it as a moral flaw. But let's say that we really kind of force this liberated sexual identity onto a place like China or Japan. It could have a fundamentally negative effect on the average person who's being taught to behave in a way that opens them up to rejection and thus gives them more mental trauma. In a sense, cultures really should consider only changing insofar as they think it would match the natural trajectory of their own culture.
Yeah, there's lots of things like geopolitical ramifications. In the early 2000s, the United States tried to do a lot of nation building, basically bringing democracy to the world. And, what the U.S. and many people thought was, well, let's show them our way, and they're going to like it, and they're going to, model their governments after the West, and, everything's going to be great. But, perhaps these people are they're genetically predestined, or they have a genetic predisposition to favor other types of governments, other types of politics that do not fit well with things like democracy. Also, you kind of get the sense that this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Like, is really there only one allele that regulates serotonin? Is that the only allele and gene in the body that can affect one's culture or one's behavior or one's, IQ, let's say, perhaps? You would be kind of stupid to think that we would stop here at this one allele. I think further scientific analysis needs to be done to determine if there are other alleles or other genes that can also affect other parts of the human body. And there is some evidence that there is that there are genetic predispositions for mental illness. For example, there was a 2014 meta-analysis that was done that examined the familial health risk of severe mental illness. The results were published in the Schizophrenia Bulletin, and they found that offspring of parents with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depressive disorder had a 1 in 3 chance of developing one of those illnesses by adulthood. That was more than twice the risk for the control offspring or of parents without severe mental illness. So we do see other scientific results and evidence that shows how genes play a large role in mental illness. In disease, of course, we know that. And here this study talks about culture. So where does it end?
Well, I fully agree that a whole lot of this is going to be something that we don't really have a choice about. We have to just go forward with the hand that we're dealt, so to speak. There's people that they will experience, they will inherit an inclination towards depression or towards certain moods. And so, yes, I definitely think it's possible for us to make positive changes, but these are all in the context of the genes that we have. There's people that they can be thin and in very good shape, but to be so, they must exercise a lot more than others. And we all know that things like height and weight, one of the big factors is genetic, and as you just showed, mental health is a genetic thing. So, we shouldn't be foolish about this, and while we should definitely fight against what negative predispositions we have, we got to be realistic and not fight too hard to try to be doing something that is beyond what we're naturally inclined to do. And I fully agree with you that the science is only going to advance on this. And we're going to keep seeing more revelations about things that aren't even disorders. Like there will probably be genetic factors that determine maybe even things like what kind of music you might be naturally inclined to listen to. Things like that. So, overall, I think we're really on the cutting edge. And as you say, this really does have a lot of wide applications that absolutely challenge assumptions that Western society have that is really, still blank slate oriented. And I would even speculate that a lot of research may have actually slowed down significantly because, scientists are people too. We like to think of them as bold people who are into free inquiry. But how true is that really? I would not be surprised that many scientists balk at doing studies like this because they don't want to be the guy that comes out with the big results and pushes forward a narrative that is going to be wildly unpopular.
Yeah, very good points. And I'm just going to make 2 more points before you finish us up. One of the things I was also thinking about was suicide rates and how this maps on statistically to these findings. So everybody knows, or I think a lot of people know, that the suicide rates in East Asian countries like Japan and South Korea are very high, generally thought of as the highest in the world. This, of course, would correlate with higher levels of, mental illness in society. And, as we know, they are collectivist societies, and people are, more prone to mental illness by having these shortened alleles. Therefore, if they do not feel as part of the group, it sort of would exacerbate their mental issues and perhaps lead to suicide. So I do think the suicide statistics map on very well to this study. And then one other note is to say that I believe this study also shows that the nation state is a very successful and a very appropriate form of organization for the world's people. Now, the reason why I think I have to say this is because it seems as nowadays, with the thoughts of open borders and, a one world government perhaps and globalist society, we're kind of fed through the media this notion of, it doesn't matter where you live, we could all just, walk across borders and, live a comfortable life in any society, any culture, and we'll just adapt. But, what this society or what this study is saying is that, no, that's not really true. The culture and I guess you could extrapolate that to the racial group that coexists within your country have similar genetic material in them as you do. So perhaps living in that culture is genetically best for you, which is something that would be absurd if you didn't read this study. But it just shows that it's deeper than just a culture that is very shallow, that you can just map on and change and swap year by year. Oh, I want to live in the United States today, or I want to live in Japan the next year. It's okay, I'll adapt. Well, it seems as if that's harder for many people than we thought otherwise.
Exactly. And that's perfect emphasis there that I fully agree with. So I definitely think in the future we'll have to look into more studies that deal with these kinds of things and tackle topics like this. I hope that all of our listeners enjoyed today's episode and that you all have a very excellent week.